How's it everyone who's watching this? This is my 76th video on the channel, and today we're looking at Anselm and Actuality, published by American logician and philosopher David Lewis in 1970. As the title suggests, this paper is an analysis of the ontological argument used by Saint Anselm of Canterbury to try to prove God's existence. It takes an approach based in logic, although with the explicit aim of avoiding the use of modal operators like necessity and possibility. Before we start, symbolization will be used quite heavily in this video, although I will translate phrases into English and explain specific elements when they come up. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. Lewis begins the paper by justifying his non-modal approach. Essentially, in modal logic, one of the central concepts is that of possible worlds, versions of reality that differ from our own, such as one where Saint Anselm was an atheist, or one where I'm English rather than South African. Modal logic studies the way in which things like truth work between these possible worlds, considering something to be necessary, like a bachelor being unmarried, if it's true in every reality accessible to what is under discussion. However, whether an argument is valid or not can sometimes be difficult to decide in this system. With Anselm and Actuality, Lewis aims to find a way to translate the notion of possible worlds into a more traditional and explicit system, where the requirements for validity are a bit more established and clear. With this in mind, we can talk about what an ontological argument actually is. Basically, the term refers to any proof of God's existence that relies on reasoning instead of experience, although the lines can get quite blurry. Saint Anselm was one of the first people to propose such an approach, with the basic outline of his ideas being represented here. In Lewis's reading, there are three central premises. First, if something exists in our understanding, we can conceive it to exist in reality. Second, something in our understanding would be greater if it actually did exist in reality, compared to if it didn't. Third, we can have something exist in the understanding that is so great that it is impossible to conceive anything more so. Taken together, these lead to the conclusion that there exists a being in reality whose greatness cannot be surpassed, usually described as God. To add a bit of nuance, the details of Anselm's argument, even including whether or not he actually proposed it, are highly controversial, with some holding Lewis's interpretation to not accurately align with the saint's other views. Nevertheless, its bare-bone nature is also why our author describes it as his favorite ontological argument. In Lewis's eyes, what we'll hold to be the Anselm approach avoids many of the pitfalls usually associated with its family of divine proofs. As he says,
"The proper name God will not appear, so we will not have to worry about the form or content of its definition. In fact, there will be no defining of anything."
By not defining anything specifically, Anselm avoids a lot of religious baggage that can obscure the form of the argument itself. Now, having looked at a basic outline, we can finally turn to Lewis's translations, beginning, of course, with that of the first premise. Given that his expressed aim is to explicitly reason about possible worlds, Lewis sees his immediate task as being to define what exactly possibility means in Anselm's context. From the phrasing, we can say conceivability. Any reality that's imaginable for us constitutes a possible world, even if some other parts are ordinarily impossible. As an example, Lewis offers the case of a 17-dimensional world as something that is inconceivable and thus outside of what we're looking at. However, a world that has a specific largest prime is conceivable, so it does count, even if it's otherwise impossible. In the language of quantified logic, we will use an uppercase U, like seen in the bottom left corner, to represent that X is understandable. Next, we need something to provide us with worlds in the first place. This is what the uppercase W is, a predicate that is read as X is a world. Finally, E stands in to explain the existence of something in a world. The variable before it exists inside the variable that follows. In other words, existence is treated as a relation of sorts, one that allows things to exist in some specific worlds, but not others. With this in mind, premise 1 is read by Lewis to hold that whatever exists in the understanding exists in a conceivable world. The reason why we use uppercase U to specifically mean understandable is to avoid treating the understanding as a world in of itself. As Lewis himself says,
"The beings do not bear to the understanding the same relation which something existing in a world bears to that world."
With our symbols in position, here is Lewis's translation of a premise. The inverted A is called the universal quantifier, whilst the reversed E is an existential one. With the notation that is used here, they're read as for all x, and there exists a W respectively. Moving on to the connectives, the arrow means implication, and the inverted V turns into and. Altogether, we get something like, for any understandable being, there exists something which is a world, and in which that being exists. Immediately, the question this raises for Lewis is whether or not it's credible. His answer is a rather unenthusiastic sure. It doesn't really mean much by itself. As he says, it's up to the ontological arguer to explain what it entails for something to exist in the understanding. To make things a bit easier for everyone, Lewis restricts the scope of his work to the actual world, meaning that we don't have to worry about giving uppercase U properties that would allow something to be understandable in one world, but not another. It's with this that we get to the second premise, one that looks a little uglier in our non-modal logic than the first. However, we need to understand some aspects of Anselm's argument before we continue, namely, what it isn't. As Lewis explains,
in some versions of the ontological argument, it seems that a hypothetical, non-existent God is supposed to be excelled in greatness by some other conceivable being.
In other words, some ontological arguments work by presupposing a fake God that can be replaced with the true existing one. Whilst Lewis completely dismisses this, saying that he can't imagine any approach close to sound using it, he is careful to stress that it is distinct from what Anselm does. The saint's argument specifically has its great being excel itself, where it's imagined that it would be greater if it existed. When it comes to symbolic logic, Lewis says that we thus must have the greatness of beings be relative to worlds. This is what he comes up with in his translation of premise 2. Breaking down the new symbols, the tick next to XEV represents negation, whilst uppercase G expresses that what comes before it exceeds what comes after it in greatness. We can read the whole thing as for any understandable being, and for any worlds V and W, if that being exists in V but not W, then its greatness in the former exceeds that in the latter. In both cases, it's the same understandable being, the same variable x. The only difference is that it exists in one world but not the other, being greater in the first as a result. Like in the case of premise 1, Lewis doesn't really have a problem with this. Greatness is such a broad category that the ontological arguer can use almost anything to justify it, as long as they are consistent in how they measure it. The problems occur when things proceed to premise 3. The basic idea here is that there is some being which is so great that we can't conceive of anything exceeding it. In the system we've been outlining throughout this video, we see that greatness is always tied to a certain conceivable world, be it W or V. Following this, the third premise can be understood as saying that there is one pair that can't be exceeded by any other. Here, things get a bit sketchy, as Lewis asks,
if greatnesses belong to beings relative to worlds, what are we talking about when we say the greatness of X? Which greatness of X? The greatness of X in which conceivable world?
Because of this ambiguity, Lewis construes 4 possible ways to translate the third premise of Anselm's ontological argument. The first interprets the greatness that is exceeded as that of the actual world, which is relatively plausible considering that we ordinarily use that reality as our baseline. However, he also supplies a weaker equivalent that focuses on worlds in general. Here, there is at least some world where being exists without being exceeded, even if it isn't necessarily the actual one. These 2 first translations are shown here, where the @ symbol represents our actual world. Although I won't translate them directly, we can broadly say that the strong translation means that there exists an understandable entity such that there doesn't exist a world where another entity exceeds it in its greatness within the actual world. For its weak equivalent, this just says that there exists an understandable entity and world such that no similar pair exceeds it in greatness. From here, Lewis goes even further, offering 2 more translations that are even stronger and weaker, respectively. The first states that there is an entity such that its greatness is not exceeded in any world whatsoever. In other words, it doesn't matter if it exists in the actual world, a world with a greatest prime or whatever else we could imagine. It is still the greatest possible thing. This contrasts the last translation that Lewis provides, which is the weakest of them all. Simply stating that there is a being whose greatness isn't exceeded by anything in at least one possible world is actually so weak that he dismisses it out of hand. Turning directly to which version of the third premise is most credible, Lewis at least moderately supports the second one we discussed, which he summarizes like so.
It says that there is a highest grade of greatness, and that this grade of greatness is occupied in some world by an understandable being.
At least at this point, he says that he has no reason to dispute it. However, having already dismissed the last of the other possible translations, he puts the question of the credibility of the 2 remainders into suspense. The final note he makes in this section concerns the interrelations between the readings, where, as long as we consider the actual world to be, well, a world, the strongest translation implies the original one, and the original one implies the second weakest translation. With this in mind, we get to the conclusion of Anselm's argument, Lewis's reading of which is shown here. Converting it into English, we get something like, there exists an understandable entity, such that it exists in the actual world, and there doesn't exist a pair of a world and similar entity that exceeds it in its greatness. Although the actual world portion isn't included in Anselm's original phrasing, it sort of goes without saying, since any other possibility would have no real theological interest. As Lewis describes it, only a fool would care if there might be a possible reality which a being with unrivaled greatness exists. The obvious next step, now that we have translated the whole argument, is to see if it's valid. Because of a routine nature of checking for validity, in the kind of non-modal logic that Lewis employs here, he simply tells us the results. Basically, it turns out that the 2 strongest readings of premise 3 work, whilst the rest fail, including the reasonably credible translation that Lewis said he had no reason to dispute. Additionally, because we can infer the weaker of the 2, our first formulation, from the stronger one, we don't really need to consider them separately. This is why Lewis explains that
the success of our form of the ontological argument therefore turns out to depend on the credibility of our first non-modal translation of the premise.
Regardless, he does begin with the strongest version of premise 3, which we will call 3c from now on. This is because, if it's credible, then the first version, or 3a, goes without saying. However, as he works through some possible reasons for an ontological arguer to accept it, Lewis just finds problems. For example, maybe they assume that every description that can be understood has an entity that matches it. The issue here appears in the form of round squares and largest primes, which obviously don't have matching entities. Although the ontological arguer might try to work around this by restricting what it means for a being to be understandable, that is also problematic. It denies premise 1. The alternative approach is more interesting, depending on the so-called principle of saturation. This dictates that any claim of an understandable entity with a certain description is true until it can be proven false. Lewis admits that this could easily support 3c, but warns that it can just as easily accomplish the inverse. In this formula, it's claimed that there is an understandable being that is greater than everything else in one world, but exceeded in greatness in another. From the perspective of the principle of saturation, both make sense. However, this sentence completely contradicts 3c, since the translation specifically maintains that the entity we care about is the greatest in all worlds. As long as the principle of saturation holds, 3c is thus impossible to defend, at least to Lewis's knowledge. This means that we have no choice other than to try to show that 3a is credible on its own, without the backing of its stronger equivalent. As you can see in this diagram, one approach to supporting it that an ontological arguer might take involves generalizing it over all worlds, of which our actual reality is only one instance amongst others. The translation can be read as, for any world V, there exists an understandable being, such that there doesn't exist any similar entity and world where the greatness exceeds that of the first pair. In other words, the greatness of one entity relative to its world isn't exceeded by that of any other in its respective reality. However, a position like this one, described as G, quickly produces problems too. In particular, it still implicitly relies on 3c, which we have already shown to not be credible. We can technically go without the stronger reading, but it leads to some very strange places. If we take the first world, V, to be a bad one, where all that exists is a single blob of mud, and the second world, W, to be the most splendid reality imaginable, some member of our mud world would have to be greater than anything in its otherwise amazing equivalent. The meaning of greatness essentially falls apart, with Lewis himself stating,
"It seems that in order to believe G without inferring it from 3c, the ontological arguer would need to adopt standards of greatness so eccentric as to rob his conclusion of its expected theological import."
As he goes on to explain, without 3c, G basically makes it so that some piece of mud in a mud world is ultimately superior to an angel in a heavenly one. Nevertheless, there is a workaround, using 3a directly without any shortcuts. The caveat is that by doing so, the ontological arguer has to accept that our actual world is somehow fundamentally different from all the other realities we can imagine. Calling it the place of greatest greatness, the actual world, under the pure version of 3a, must be able to have entities that exceed all others. For Lewis, the question of what makes our reality special is a vexing one, especially since, given the nature of the ontological argument, we can't base things off empirical data, like the beauty of people and mountains, or the wisdom of philosophers. Instead, we seem to have to rely on the idea that actuality itself is the source of our world's uniqueness. As Lewis explains, this, at least on the face of it, seems completely reasonable. We tend to view what's actual as more important than what's merely possible, seeing it as solid and lively, in contrast to the ghostly and faded realities that surround it. It is here that Lewis's infamous modal realism begins to appear. If you aren't familiar with his other work, he holds the relatively fringe position that possible worlds are just as real as the one we experience, rather than simply being hypothetical tools that make logic easier to deal with. Whilst modal realism doesn't play a particularly explicit role in this text, the undercurrents are still there. He begins his discussion of actuality by dismissing the idea that it makes things special as not only weak, but mistaken. He argues that we should instead think about actuality as an indexical term, or a phrase that has what it references depend on context. Just like the word present changed referent between 10 minutes ago and now, referring at a specific time to, well, that time, the word actual shifts its content depending on the world that's occupied. In other words, in any world, like one called W, actual refers to that W. Although this might sound a bit complicated already, it gets a bit more so, with Lewis explaining.
We can distinguish primary and secondary senses of actual by asking what world actual refers to at a world W in a context in which some other world V is under consideration.
Take two sentences, like if Max ate less, he would be thinner than he actually is, and if Max ate less, he would actually enjoy himself more. In the first case, actually is being used in its primary sense. It marks the world that Max currently inhabits, with the possibility of being thinner relegated to another reality. However, in the other case, we find actual in its secondary sense. The phrase, he would actually enjoy himself more, points towards another world, one where, as the phrase suggests, he enjoys himself more than he does in his current one. This discussion takes us all the way back to the last translation Lewis gave of premise 3, the one he rejected outright. Displayed here, it holds that the actual greatness of one understandable being isn't surpassed by that of another being in another world. Unlike 3a, which uses actual in its primary sense to describe our reality, this reading of a premise uses the secondary sense of a term. Whilst, as we'll soon see, this makes more sense in some ways than 3a, it still completely lacks credibility, due to how useless it is for anyone interested in theology. Like we discussed earlier, no one cares whether some world other than theirs might have a god. Turning to justifying his indexical approach, Lewis says that it's useful in explaining why it's absurd to be skeptical about our own actuality. When we try to answer the question of how we know that we are not the unactualized inhabitants of a likewise unactualized world, we can't depend on evidence. As he mentions, unactualized grass is no less green than its actualized equivalent, at least in some worlds. In the same way, unactualized money doesn't buy any more unactualized food. However, we obviously aren't just possible. As Lewis puts it,
the indexical analysis of actuality explains how we know it. In the same way, I know that I am me, that this time is the present, or that I am here.
All of these are indexicals, being true whenever they are uttered. When I say that I'm in the present, the specific content shifts from time to time, but that doesn't change its fixed meaning. When I say that I'm actual, then my possible world is too. Linking back to modal realism, there's thus a plurality of worlds that could be actual, although we can't say that all are. In Lewis's words,
all worlds are actual is false whenever uttered in any world. Everyone may truly call his own world actual, but no one, wherever located, may truly call all the worlds actual. It is the same with time.
For example, when someone gives an indexical analysis of time, the fact that, at any time, we can say that this time is the present, doesn't mean that all times are always present. To demonstrate this, Lewis tells us to imagine viewing time from the outside. If we ignore our own position in time, the meaning of past, present, and future melts away. However, this isn't because everything becomes present. Rather, it's because we no longer use indexicals that let us qualify what is before us and what is after us. Likewise, if we somehow manage to examine all conceivable possible worlds externally, the difference between our actual reality and the others disappears. This isn't because actuality applies to every single one, but rather because, if we ignore our location amongst the worlds, we can no longer use actual as an indexical. It is in this way that we can't accept 3a as being credible. Whilst it is logically valid, it requires there to be only one actual world that is special as a result of that actuality. Something that, as Lewis's Indexical analysis shows, is deeply problematic. For every ontological arguer in our world, there is an infinity of other ontological arguers who find the world they occupy special only insofar as it relates to them. This is why Lewis states,
"The ontological arguer, saying that his world is special because his world alone is the actual world, is as foolish as a man boasting that he has the special fortune to be alive at a unique moment, the present."
Bringing all we've discussed together, the best versions of Anselm's ontological argument, when translated into Lewis's brand of non-modal logic, include the first and second translations of premise 3. Nevertheless, both unfortunately fail on account of a lack of credibility and validity, respectively. However, this doesn't mean that this paper itself was unsuccessful. Rather, it demonstrates the usefulness of a non-modal approach and the indexical nature of actuality, an idea that plays a significant role in analytic metaphysics. With this, we finish Anselm and Actuality by David Lewis, having outlined a non-modal approach to possible worlds and some of the problems associated with the ontological argument for the existence of God. I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something, and if you feel I got anything wrong, wasn't as clear as I could have been, please do feel free to let me know in the comments so I can do better. Next time, we'll finally be starting the Monadology by G.W. Leibniz. Until then, bye!